I'm very excited to introduce the moderator of our first panel. Is my friend and colleague, David Grusky. David Grusky is the Edward Ames Edmonds Professor in the School of Humanities and Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and a Senior Fellow here at CEPR, and the Director of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. And he's also a co-editor of Pathways magazine. He is a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, co-recipient of the 2004 Max Weber Award, founder of the Cornell University Center for the Study of Inequality, and a former presidential young investigator. I could go on and on and on about Professor Grusky's many accomplishments. I'll just tell you one other thing. His recent books are Inequality in the 21st Century, Social Stratification, Occupy the Future, The New Gilded Age, and The Great Recession. His research examines changes in the amount, type, and sources of inequality. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Grusky.
Thanks, Mark. Way too generous. You're the engine of inflation. So let's get down to business. I want to welcome everyone to this first panel, a panel on housing affordability and economic vulnerability. We have a superstar lineup. We have Gary Painter, professor in the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California, also director of the Sol Price Center for Social Innovation, also director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, also chair of the Department of Public Policy. That's a lot of leadership for one person. That's like Deganian leadership, right? But there's more. He also leads in the world of scholarship, perhaps best known for his work on funding social innovation. He's one of the top provocateurs, for example, in the world of social impact bonds, and has just released a book on social impact bonds in the US and the UK. Additionally, a leading scholar of housing, urban economics, and educational policy, and has published influential papers in all of those fields. The second speaker today, Regina Williams, is another superstar. Don't say CEPR doesn't give you the top talent. You do. Point of pride, I have to mention first off that she's originally from Stanford, having earned her bachelor's degree in urban studies here. Then she went off to Penn for an advanced degree. Happily, she came back and is making big things happen, and we'll learn more about that soon. As executive director at SV at Home, she leads policy and advocacy for affordable housing in Silicon Valley. Prior to joining SV at Home, she served as director of housing development at First Community Housing, a leading affordable housing developer in San Jose. She earlier was a member of the National Development Council's East team, providing housing and economic development counseling while leading also their green initiatives. And that's not all. She's also worked at the National Housing Trust, where she structured financing for affordable green housing alternatives. A very warm welcome to Regina Williams. Our final panelist, Chris Coe, is our third leading light. He's the Vice President of Impact and Strategy for the United Way of Greater Los Angeles. It's a bit of a job. His charge is ensuring that everyone in LA County, that's that small county somewhere in the South, I don't know where, that everyone in LA County has a quality education, a stable job, and safe housing, a bit of a charge. His accomplishments are legendary. He built the coalitions that were needed to pass historic ballot measures around housing, homelessness, and racial justice. He's been a leader in the homelessness count and the coordinated entry system, which became a model for the country. So that's our all-star panel. And so here's how it's going to come down. Each of our panelists are going to present a 5-minute set piece. Then I'm going to fire questions at them. And after that, we're going to open up to questions from the floor. So let's get right to it. We'll begin, as listed on the schedule, with Gary Painter. Welcome.
We have Chris go up next.
Oh, my apologies. Chris is going first. So I did an excellent moderating job so far.
Gary's the main act, so you got to let me be the opener. Gary's Jerry. We got Beyonce and Jay-Z coming up. I'll be the opener. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure and honor to be with you all. this morning. Old friends, new friends, hopefully by the end of today. I want to kick off this morning with a cautionary tale of an oversight we made that I hope as we move forward that we don't collectively make together as we move forward with this. And how does this work? Do I just click? 1 second. Slideshow, current slide. All right, no, I think those are the extra slides. Great, okay. So 12 years ago, I accepted Christine Margiotta's offer to join Home for Good, which was the United Way and the LA Area of Chambers regional plan to end homelessness. And our theory was pretty straightforward. It was simple. We had ID'd two populations in homelessness, one which had economic challenges, another which had more structural barriers. You heard Zhao Lu talk about that a little bit earlier. And even though the second group was the smaller group, and if though it was a quarter, we identified that this group consumed 3/4 of the resources. So the theory of change was if we solve this more structural problem, that we could redistribute some of those resources and that efficient resource allocation back to the 3/4. And we had tremendous success. We organized a movement. We became California's largest community-based response to homelessness, largest non-governmental response to homelessness. And we saw permanent housing rates more than double. So on the left side, we started in 2009, but over the first 5 years, you see permanent housing rates go from 4,000 to nearly 10,000. But even that, for us, we realized was a scale that we didn't think was enough. So we organized two of the first dedicated measures on homelessness in the country to try to increase that number even more. So this is how we got to that number that Zhao Lu talked about earlier. 207 permanent exits per day. So every day in LA County, this is not just a shelter. These are over 200 people leaving homelessness permanently every day in LA County. So when we started here. So we thought that would all equal this chart continuing to head down. And as you saw, this is what actually happened to the chart of the homeless count. Because even though we did that, this is far less dramatic now that Zhao Lu did this earlier. But even though this number is 5 times where we started, right? We started this, and throughout our time, over 10 years, we more than quintupled the number of people permanently being housed. But the number that grew even more was the people who became homeless every day. Because in this span, what happened was counterintuitively, what happened was the economic recovery of California, LA County. We started during the recession, but as California became a destination, as tech became a driver of economies, as things moved from finance in New York to California, West Coast, San Francisco to LA, the economic recovery meant that a lot of people got left behind. Most specifically, what that resulted were in rents rising. So this in one number is the story of homelessness in LA County, which was that we lost 300,000 affordable units in that same decade, right? Over 100,000 that rent for $1,000 to $1,499, 200,000 units lost that rent for less than $1,000 a month. Right? So take that in for a second. Seeing that this is what this looks like in the life of a particularly vulnerable population, older adults. So the red line is the HUD fair market rate for a studio apartment, an efficiency. And then the white, you can't actually see it here, but there is a white line here, which the combination of this blue and the white means the total amount of SSI that an older adult gets in the state of California. The blue is the federal amount, California has a supplement. So what you see is that around this time, that an older adult on a fixed income, right, an older adult past working age on fixed income, on a very black and white math equation, can no longer live in a place, right? Up until less than 10 years ago, just with SSI, they could afford to at least live somewhere on their own even, but at least live in a shared apartment. So the blue line is what a shared apartment looks like. And then over the last 5 years, you see both of those things become out of reach. It's a very simple math problem for someone who, again, no longer can work at a sustainable income and who lives off fixed income. And that is the story of homelessness for a particularly vulnerable population. Polar ice caps have melted. What I mean by that is I think a lot of times when we talk about solutions to homelessness, it reminds me of when we talk about global warming and we talk about turning down the heat and installing some solar panels, while the magnitude has substantially grown. When I hear solutions to interim housing, I do hear some of that scale, right? When we talk about thousands of tiny homes, safe parking, I do hear that scale of an approach. I don't hear it on the issue of housing affordability. And there are populations for whom this has always been true. Black people, people in foster-involved systems, there are populations that this country has long disregarded and long not held ground for. But when you see it in populations like older adults or families, the Latinx populations, other groups that there have been more generous benefits for over time, and you see it structurally go out of reach, we're talking about a problem that is far different than the problem we were talking about even 10 years ago. And so that's first population that we thought was fairly static for a time. That 75% that used to have economic challenges is now a far different story. You see it even in here. When I started the work, you could reasonably expect someone to get out of shelter in 90 days to 6 months. Now, 6 months, if there's any service providers in the room, you are clapping your hands if someone makes it out of shelter in 6 months, much less 2 years. So the story of economic homelessness is one in which that temporary solution on its own no longer is the final pathway out. What does that mean? While they're in the shelter, while they're still on the street, it means they're developing acuities they didn't have previously. And so when we don't talk about the fundamental economic challenge, we are also getting into all of the other issues that we'll be talking about later today. The one thing, we got to play this on both sides if we're talking about a polar ice cap situation. The one thing I don't hear enough about is the fundamental issue. Do people have enough money to put toward rent? Streamlining, regulatory issues, permitting, those are all really necessary but not sufficient for the problem today. Those are things that over a generation may result in filtering and lowered house prices. But for the population today, in that same time, how are we going to actually help them get the money they need to pay rent so that when those things are built, they can sustainably live there? I think we all agree that we are in an emergency. I don't think anyone has to be convinced that we're in an emergency. I don't know if we all agree what kind of emergency we're in, right? So a lot of people think this is a cleanup job where if we declare a state of emergency to clean up the issues that have happened, we can move on with it. I would offer to you that we are still in the storm and another storm is coming. So we can we need to build all of the temporary solutions that need to happen. But that number of 20 a day, that would mean we would need to build a high capacity shelter every month to just keep up with what's happening to come inside. So even as we do that, that's where I'm talking about we need to figure out a fundamental fix to the income issue. And I think it's possible. It's possible. When you see it with vulnerable populations that we have historically been generous for, it is a call to reset the floor on what we're talking about. This is a picture of New Orleans after Hurricane Ida, where they faced a moment after Katrina and the time that happened afterwards where they had to make a decision. Do we keep cleaning up? Do we keep relocating people? Do we keep offering that same temporary fix? Or do we look at a more fundamental solution? Do we do the cleanup or do we build the levee? The choice is ours.
All right, well, thank you to the organizers for having me be part of this, and the GLU and also Chris has really laid out the structural issues. I'm going to try to focus my attention and my conversation just on some of the other heterogeneity within the homeless population, because I think it's important to kind of understand what that is. Chris alluded to it, and I'm just going to jump right in for sake of time. Chris alluded to the fact that the vulnerabilities are not the same across populations, and so when one actually looks at race and ethnicity, what we see is that if you are Black, if you are an indigenous population in the US, that you're much more likely to be represented within the homeless population than you are within the general population. That's consequential and is due to all sorts of systemic issues, which we can return to in the panel if we would like to do so. As Chris said, the Latino population weren't as represented among the homeless, and that's been rapidly increasing. So I just wanted that point to put in your mind. Another point Chris mentioned is this issue of people who are over 65 who are becoming homeless. It's rising. The cost to serve them is much higher than the cost to serve people under 55, and their health deteriorates even faster than someone else who's experiencing homelessness. And so that's something we have to keep front and center. One of the things that has come up a couple times is this notion of chronic homeless versus non-chronic homeless. And I think it's important just to make sure everybody has that definition. So if you're chronically homeless, that means that you have been homeless more than a year and you have a disabling condition. I'm going to use the term newly homeless, which means that that one is easier to understand because it just means you've been homeless less than a year, and give you some sense of how they differ across time. This is based on a demographic survey in Los Angeles, and you can see that the newly homeless in red have higher rates of citing economic issues as the reason they are homeless than people who are chronically homeless, but economics matters a great deal for both. When you look at differences across disabling conditions, it should be the case because the definition of chronic, that you face more disabling conditions, whether it's mental illness, physical illness, or disability. Among the newly homeless, though, we see that these rates are much smaller in terms of having these various disabilities. And so when you see the conversation about mental illness, you really do have to understand that the issue of mental illness is not among the newly homeless. The newly homeless are the majority of the homeless population. Among the people who become homeless in a given year, like for instance in Los Angeles, 1/3 of the population is roughly chronically homeless. 1/3 lives on the streets. 1/3 live in their cars. The people that live in their cars, 80% are working. 20% are working full-time. Like, this is a population, you need to kind of appreciate what that means. And as Chris had the great, just kind of simple illustration, you become homeless, then health and other conditions attenuate. You start to get worse. And people who are living on the streets actually acquire substance abuse disorder at very rapid rates, and they had no issues before. We do have to think about what's happening among those people who are becoming newly homeless. And so when we think about drivers, again, it's important to kind of orient ourselves in this way. We cannot talk about drivers without talking about institutional and systemic racism. That's why we see overrepresentation in the Black and the indigenous population, and that may be able to be addressed in our panel or later here today. I know there's another whole panel on constrained housing supply. I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to focus my remarks on in kind of this question of, there are so many people, and the polar ice cap melting is a really good one because it kind of shows how hard it is for me as an economist to try to figure out what is the event that I can use in my analysis to say, if we just change this policy, we can get rid of homelessness. Because that's not how it's actually worked. What it's worked is that people who are experiencing rent burden, the percentage of income is rent. So let me just say this. I'm going to focus on severe rent burden. Here in California, there are 1.2 million households that pay more than half their income as rent. That represents roughly 2.5 to 3 million people who are in those circumstances. Among that group, they have elevated risk of homelessness compared to any other population, right? But it's still rare. Right? How many people experience homelessness? 150, 160,000 people. So this is not a group that you can just simply kind of say, oh, you're about to become homeless, so we're going to do that. Despite the work around big data techniques, predictive analytics, and so forth, that's not going to solve this problem of who actually becomes homeless among those people who are experiencing so much. So the one issue Chris brought up before, we don't have the wage job growth enough to match the rents. So that's something that's real, and as those of us who are economists in the room should really think about how our economy is functioning for people who are low and moderate income. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the safety net because it may not come up again today. Like, is our safety net in California sufficient to support those people who are going to fall into, adverse conditions, lose their job, whatever the case might be? And so we did a report at the Price Center for Social Innovation where we did focus on kind of what does the safety net look like. We did it with a partner, Imagine LA, who works with a lot of families who had experienced homelessness, so that we could have kind of that kind of nuance and structure of people who had that lived experience, but also just to look at the data on how the safety net works. And so what I think most people know what the safety net is. It's a combination of cash, in-kind benefits. Some of the cash is in the form of tax credits. Some of it's in the form of actual payments given to people. The idea of our safety net in the U.S. is to support work that's explicit in the legislation from the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And what we find is that the experiences of low and moderate income is that the safety net just simply has too many holes. We don't have time to talk about all the programs that are involved, but we are looking at programs that are especially focused on supporting families, not individuals, people with disabling conditions like SSI or SSDI. The safety net among all these 15 different programs in these different categories get deployed to folks in a variety of different ways. So this is like I don't even know what to call it, like the spider web graph, so if you are receiving housing assistance, at $0 earned, so this horizontal axis is how much you've earned, and this is the value of resources that come with your earnings, plus your tax credits, plus your benefits, et cetera. That's the largest benefit, is your housing assistance, and it kind of just tapers off, because for those of us that know the structure of the voucher program, it covers 30% of it requires that you pay 30% of your net income as rent, so it just kind of tapers off as if you have it, right? The second largest is the CalWORKs child care subsidy. And then there's just a combination of a lot of small benefits. You have the EITC for someone who studied public finance at Berkeley. I got used to seeing this graph as it became much more dominant compared to cash assistance, our CalWORKs here in California. And this is another way to kind of look at it. This big green is like your net income going up in terms of your earned income and how everything else just kind of layers on top of it. And you can see, it's just kind of, you can see that benefits and resources are relatively flat. Again, if you get most of them, this is a graph that shows the reality that only 1 in 5 people eligible for housing assistance actually get it, so they're not on here. This line here is the calculation of what is required to living wage. This is from the MIT living wage calculator, so these are the resources needed to live in one of our coastal cities. And you can see that, basically families, even if they're getting everything other than housing, the childcare being the biggest one, they're not getting to that line, right? So they're vulnerable consistently. They're severely rent burdened. And what does that mean? Well, it turns out that that's this blue line here. If you get housing, it does put you above, right? And we can talk about work disincentives. That was my PhD dissertation at Berkeley 30 years ago, so I'm always happy to talk about that in a room with economists. It's like, wow, that's flat. Why should I work if it's going down? All those kinds of things. And we can talk about the research on that. But the reality is that most families are this yellow line. Okay, and that's way below what's needed, the resources. And the reason it is that until you become incredibly poor with no assets and income, you don't actually qualify for CalWORKs. And without qualifying for CalWORKs, you don't get the CalWORKs child care subsidy, which is a third of the overall benefit package. And we know that only 1 in 5 people get the housing voucher that they're eligible for. And so you're actually down here, right? You're not up here. And so it's kind of, there's good news and bad news, but it's mostly bad news, sadly. And so these are the holes, as we just mentioned. And then the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that individuals are really not part of the safety net. If you have mixed status families, immigrants, the parents might not be eligible for things. There is an issue of people not necessarily taking up their benefits at the same rate that they could, but that I think is less of an issue than what's going on. So single people, it's just not there. There's a whole other issue of navigation. Like, how do you actually kind of navigate and move from social benefits to tax credits? The group that we worked with on this project, Imagine LA, happened to have a tax lawyer as part of their board. And so when someone was like, I don't want to work anymore because I'm going to lose my benefits, they said, well, let's look at the tax system. And so there's, oh, you're going to get those benefits. You know, it's just going to switch to tax credits. It goes from child care benefit to child care tax credit. And people had no idea that was the case. But that's another issue for another time. I think for today, and again, I've kind of rushed through just for sake of time, and I probably still didn't keep it in 5 minutes. Sorry, David. I think what Chris said is like most homelessness policy has focused on the chronically homeless. That's not a bad thing, because this is the population of people who are most at risk of dying on the streets. Like, that is a population that should get priority. But what it hasn't done is focused on kind of how the dynamics of people moving into homelessness address, and it doesn't address housing insecurity more generally. It's very hard to target people who are becoming homeless, and so what we probably need to do is to rethink here in California, where we just had the largest budget surplus we've ever had, to think about, well, what could it mean? And you know, I've written a couple of op-eds on the topic, but if we actually did rental tax credits or something for families while they wait for their voucher, do something to support them. I would recommend tying it to some sort of good behavior provision, that people allow building in their places, but you know, and that gets complicated in the kind of political system and so forth. But I'm going to stop there, and again, I appreciate the time to share. There's so much more to say, and I'd love to follow up with you, Mark, specifically because I represent the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, which is backboned at the Price Center for Social Innovation, and the whole goal of its existence. And Chris in United Way was a leader in kind of creating it, and the Hilton Foundation was to bridge the Mars-Venus gap and to kind of put us in the center. So hopefully we've learned a few things in the last 4 years. So thank you, and Regina, the floor is yours.
Well, I don't know about you all, but I'm so grateful to be here today, to be taking in all of this information. And I'm actually very excited to get to the conversation piece. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to share a few tidbits from our research about housing in the Bay Area that can enlighten the conversation. So I'm with SV at Home, and we're a nonprofit affordable housing advocacy and policy shop. And for us, we really use data to talk to folks all across the spectrum. So we live at the intersection. All of the folks who work with community-based organizations, directly serving populations that may be low income or marginalized, to developers, to funders, to tech companies. We work at that intersection, and so I'm so very grateful for Mark and the Institute today to understand that we need to come together and talk about the issues of housing affordability. So what we really have seen is that there's a huge increase in the jobs housing imbalance. This is the foundation of the arguments that we make when we go to cities and their staff, when they're considering housing policy, when we go to advocate for more affordable housing and policies that support building at greater densities, is that here in the Silicon Valley, in this economic engine, jobs are increasing tremendously. There is wealth being built and created and accumulated. However, housing is not meeting the need. We are not building enough housing to keep up with that imbalance. And so there are policies that we advocate for, like commercial linkage fees, things that tie the growth in the economic engine to building more housing so that everyone can continue to live here and thrive. So here, this talks a little bit about how rents continue to go up. We all recognize, and the data showed, as Chris shared, that in the last decade, even with the recession, there has been a tremendous increase in the inaffordability of being able to live here in Silicon Valley. So rents are going up and up and up. and the ability to access this housing is very challenging. And this is, again, because of the lack of affordable housing and housing in general being built. And so it's clearly a supply and demand issue. Here we have the home prices for purchasing going up and up and up. So again, supporting the idea that affordability is just out of reach for most people, and it continues to do so. And so this is really the data point that I want to hammer on today, which is, although we did see some flattening of rents during the pandemic, a lot of that was at the high end. What we've seen is that the increase in housing production is happening at the luxury end, at the market rate. And those that can only afford, the lower end of the spectrum are the ones who are falling out of being housed into being unhoused. And that is because when you have housing affordability really drop, the folks who may be able to afford the high end, they start to access maybe moderate markets, and then it all impacts the folks at the bottom who are the most vulnerable to falling into being unhoused in our community. So again, the rents at the bottom still continue to go up, even while there may be some flattening at the top. Here, I wanted to show a little bit about what people can afford. So here's some data that shows that in order to be able to afford a 3-bedroom, it's really out of reach for most folks who work in our community. A 2-bedroom, perhaps there are folks like a firefighter or a police officer, but you really see our everyday folks, elementary teachers, construction workers, people who work in retail, all of this housing, the average 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, all tremendously out of reach for these folks. And so in Santa Clara County, we do have the community plan to end homelessness. It's really grounded on understanding the breadth of the need and trying to provide assistance to families, to individuals at every end of the spectrum. So, for example, we have here, something that shows sort of the continuum of services being provided, all the way from permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, those who may be at risk of homelessness, to homelessness prevention services, things to help people stay in their housing, in their units, and everything in between. And so the goal of the county is really to provide a comprehensive plan of helping folks stay housed or get housed and prevent homelessness. And then I just wanted to share a little bit about the success of this plan. At the very top in this chart, the goal was to build 20,000 units by 2025. We're already to a third of our goal since 2020. So the county is very aggressively working to create more units and house more folks and provide more housing placement. And then the goal here was to reduce the inflow of individuals into homelessness, and they met their goal. The baseline was to reduce it by 30%, and they surpassed that recently. They do believe, the folks at the county's Office of Supportive Housing do believe that some of the eviction moratoriums and things like that were a huge support in them reaching this goal so soon in their plan. But there are very aggressive efforts to keep people housed. And then the last thing I wanted to show was just right here. This chart that shows the program utilization, the fact that, this whole continuum is highly being used by folks in our community. And so I just want to end with the fact that we know that the goal ending homelessness is possible, but we need to build more housing. And so SV at Home, we talk about protecting tenants to prevent displacement, preserving existing affordable housing units. There was a chart shown earlier about how many affordable units we're losing every year, and to produce more housing, because it really is a supply and demand issue, especially here in this tremendous economic engine that is Silicon Valley.
Thank you. These are wonderful presentations. I'm going to invite now our three speakers to come up to the stage. And we're now going to open up a conversation. I'm under strict orders to get us back on schedule. I have a boatload of questions. I'm not going to ask all of them. I'll select a few, I'll pose them, and then we'll open it up to the floor. We have till 10:35. I got 5 extra minutes because this is too important not to get at least 5. Thanks, Mark. But we're going to stop at 10:35. Okay, I'll get right to it. First question, and I want to begin with the observation. We're an impatient people because of election cycles, because of the press of immediate needs, for a host of other reasons. We want to get the job done now. We have no taste for institutional solutions, big to systemic problems. We opt instead for, one might argue, the Band-Aid. So for the last 20 years, we've been trying to solve the homelessness crisis next year. And that's arguably a recipe for 20 years of failure. I'm being a provocateur here. I'm just setting you up. You can shoot me down. So what if 20 years ago, instead of going for the Band-Aid, we had said this is a systemic institutional problem. We've got market failure, we've got institutional failure. That lies behind the problem. Let's take on those big ticket problems. Let's give us 20 years to solve those problems because they're big institutional market failure problems. And then at the end of the 20 years, let's get the job done. Instead of saying, let's do it next year. Would that work? Is that the right diagnosis? Or is that too simplistic? I'll throw it open to any of you who want to take that on.
I'm happy to start, but I think I don't want to take too much of the thunder from the next panel, which is focused on housing supply. I think 20 years ago, we were already 20 years into a government failure to add to the market failure, but it's an interactive failure. It's the fact that because of government's restriction of policy, because the courts have enforced our environmental legislation in a particular way, and we basically just made the decision that in the 1980s, we had enough Californians. You know, it was good. People who were here, this was great, and we liked it how it was. And so we've restricted zoning, restricted building, we've downzoned. People in Los Angeles City might know that the city of Los Angeles in the 60s was zoned for over 10 million units. By essentially 2005, it had been reduced to 4.4 million units in terms of what could be built. The Senate Bill 9 and 10 and ADU legislation allows more building with duplexes and so forth, so that's increased, and I haven't gone through a report the Urban Institute just put out to figure out how much it's increased to. But given that we took 40 years, to your point, David, to get to a restricted housing building supply, Regina had a great graph on the jobs and housing imbalance, then it's going to take 20 years once we undo some of the restrictions. But I hope I didn't take any thunder away from the next panel, but I think that is also fundamental. And then the point that I made about the safety net, like if we're going to do that to us, then that is going to increase the number of people experiencing vulnerability. And if we don't actually address the holes in the safety net, then that vulnerability is going to lead to people experiencing homelessness. So those are the choices that we have in front of us in the short term and the long term.
Normally, I lament the term limit, short-term crisis issue, but thinking about it right now with you asking it, it makes me think it's a complicating factor, but not fundamentally a bad one. What I mean by that is that I do think it is as urgent as we make it to be. People are actually dying. Our communities are not what we want them to be, any of us, housed or unhoused. So I think that urgency is fair, but I think urgency makes us reach for quick solutions, things that have been done, doesn't leave enough time for the political process to tackle more fundamental issues. And I think that's what results in the kind of narrow solutions that we often find ourselves. I'm glad, Regina, you mentioned the inflow data was really powerful, because that's an example of we had an emergency, we reached for an immediate solution, which was we pumped more rental assistance into people's pockets than we have done in my lifetime. That was an immediate, quick, urgent solution that had the effect of stemming inflow in a substantial way, which results in certain homeless counts. Like San Francisco was basically flat, right? You saw inflow go up in the East Bay and other places where you saw gentrification having gone up, but you saw things become flat in a period of time where you would have thought homelessness would have continued to go up. So I don't think urgency is in and of itself a problem, as long as we can reach for more substantial solutions that tackle the root of the issue that people just can't pay their rent.
And I guess I'd just add that the recognition that it is a structural and systemic issue, if we had recognized that, which means tying all of our individual responsibility to opening up our areas for more housing, I think that makes a huge difference. It's a framework shift that we need to do. And if we had done it 20 years ago, I do think that our communities would look a lot different. And I'm hopeful that they're going to look different moving forward, understanding, as Gary mentioned, what we've been doing.
Thank you. And something we didn't know 20 years ago, the impact of the open global market, right? And there are certain things we could not have known 20 years ago, but we have to respond to them today, which is, we're competing with buyers from outside, we're competing with institutional investors for housing in a way this country has never seen. Those are things that I don't know many people were predicting the scale of that 20 years ago, but it has come to be today, and we have to respond to it.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn now to kind of more of the short-term press of immediate needs and ask about getting money into the pockets of people, enough money to make it possible for them to afford housing. And my question is a simple one. Is there any reason to care from the point of view of a homelessness expert about how that happens? So there's lots of ways to get money into the pockets of people, into the pockets of the low-income population. We could run a hotter labor market. We could raise minimum wages even higher. We could turn to a guaranteed income. We could ramp up rent subsidies or Section 8 housing vouchers. So is there a reason, here's my question, is there a reason for a homelessness expert to have a dog in that fight, or should it be that other considerations, like as Gary noted, like effects on labor supply, should they govern the choice of how to get more money into low-income pockets, and you're kind of indifferent to it? So if we're talking about immediate needs, getting money into the pocket so people can afford the housing as it now stands, where do we go? How do we choose from among the array of options on the table?
Tell us the answer, Gary.
I was going to say I answered first last time. Someone else should begin the conversation.
Still have the answer.
I mean, I can say I don't think it's we should care how that money gets into folks' pockets, because it's still a competition. One of the graphs that I showed, and I talked a little bit about it, but folks are competing for housing. Jobs are going up, folks are competing for housing, and a lot of folks have much more money than others. So what happens? The folks who have the lesser money, they use a higher percentage of what they have to afford housing. And the folks who have more money, maybe they don't use as much a percentage, and then it's affordable to them. But they're still going to get that housing. And so if we don't have the homes for folks to live in, then they're still going to be using more and more of a percentage of the funds that they're bringing in for that housing. And so we absolutely have to put more money into people's pockets, but I don't care how we do it from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that there's been research study after research study that shows that the most effective way to stabilize families is to give them unrestricted cash. This should appeal to those of us as economists in the room because we like kind of the idea of consumer autonomy. It should also appeal to those who actually want to give people power over their circumstances. And so what we tend to do, on the other hand, with housing, is that we tend to kind of tie it with whether it's the Housing Choice Voucher Program to a set of relationships between the federal government, the local landlord, the PHA, the Public Housing Authority. Rapid rehousing does this a little bit, but not as much, such that we make it even all the more hard for people to find units that might be available if there are a few. As you said, Regina, there aren't that many. It's because people who have higher incomes are competing for those units that used to be below median rent, and that below median rent now is above median rent of 5 years ago. So I think we do know that cash in people's pockets does address short-term crises, and Chris gave the example of the pandemic. Don't restrict it, don't give it to the landlord and so forth. The evidence suggests you give it to the person to address the immediate need, and then we can simultaneously address the structural issues.
And then they can better compete. If they have less restrictions on those funds, they can better compete in the market.
I think as a homelessness and housing stakeholder, I think a few things. One, I think we should be interested in things that are politically viable and feasible because time does matter, right? There may be a grand thing that is just politically impossible that we could debate for 10 years. So I do think it's incumbent on us to choose solutions and framings that can resonate with the public and political officials. I do think administrative pathways matter as a stakeholder in homelessness because we know certain things about how our unhoused neighbors can or can't receive benefits, right? If it requires addresses, if it requires other things. So I think we should choose, if that's what it's meant to address, we should choose administrative pathways that are easier. As a homelessness stakeholder, I think if you work in the field, the job burnout, retention, turnover issue in the service sector is really a massive threat. And so things that administratively, not only for a person who is unhoused, but the other benefit of an administratively simple solution is that it will not tax an already exhausted workforce to try to do means testing in a way that, quite frankly, is impossible right now with the current workforce.
Okay, I'm going to just do one more. I have to do this one, and then I'll turn it over to open it up to the floor. In one of the slides, I can't remember which one, institutional and systemic racism was listed as one of the key drivers. And so my question is simple, but I think a crucial one. How can we develop solutions that recognize and take on the role of institutional and systemic racism?
So I'll begin because you can talk about the pathways. One particular pathway is just simply that Black people are over-policed. They're more likely to be arrested. Data from Los Angeles that I've looked at with the LAPD is that they're 3 times more likely to be stopped than other populations. The Latino population is like 1.5 times more likely, but the Black population in particular, what we know from that is that if you have an arrest or a conviction or you've actually been incarcerated, any of those 3 can show up on a criminal background check, even if they're not supposed to all the time. Expungement doesn't happen when it's supposed to routinely. And that leads to job instability and housing instability directly. And so that's just one example of a system that because of how it operates, it actually leads to labor market instability and housing market instability. And we could certainly talk about many other systems that have led to kind of the outcomes that we observe today, but I'll just stop there as one.
So we look at a couple of different ways to address structural racism and how the legacy of it that's created the world we see today. One is dismantling that structure of racism that exists in zoning and land use regulation. We really believe that policies that look to open up local control, open up those tools that were put in place to restrict access to folks who are of color, from marginalized backgrounds. It's really important to attack those systems because they're in place and we have to open them up and so that we can build more housing and create communities that are vibrant and everyone can live in them and live close to amenities and jobs and everything else. The other thing that we focus on in our coalition building is shifting power. And we do that by working with BIPOC communities, community-based organizations that are BIPOC-led, and talk a lot about community ownership. We have initiatives around Community Opportunity to Purchase Act in San Jose and other communities in the South Bay. We're also working with the South Bay Community Land Trust around the decommodification of housing. And so really working on a smaller scale, but a more meaningful scale about like who owns and controls land and therefore like where does the power lie? Because it really does need to shift away from where the power has been placed with wealthy individual landowners and placed to the broader community and people of color.
Two things for me. One, I do think this issue of raising the floor on benefits or income that everyone has, I do think is a racial justice issue in and of itself. I think it's a form, a temporary small form of reparations because it is clear who has the money right now and who doesn't have the money, which has all historically been true, but now it's even more visible and obvious because the budget, because we're not in a situation where collectively economically we don't have enough. We had a $100 billion surplus this year. The government doesn't have a surplus if companies and other people are not making money. That means we made a whole lot more money collectively, socially, than we expected to. So even in this situation with homelessness raging, we are overall, there are people who are doing incredibly well. And so this issue of like, can we afford, we avoid the income benefit increase solution because it feels expensive, but I would offer that it is our collective energy, attention, the time of 150 people spending a day at a conference together. Like these are all the equivalent costs socially on us to avoid this solution. And if we were to attempt it or to look at it seriously, I think that in and of itself would be a massive form of racial equity shifting and racial justice. And I think as we think about those, the second thing it makes me think about is ownership. Beyond just relief and service relief, as we build buildings, as we do these things, I think creating pathways for tenant ownership in these situations, creating opportunities for BIPOC developers and communities to own these things together so that it's not only a leaving of poverty, but that we can do it in a way that also restores community control and ownership and profit sharing to these ventures.
And I'll just say one more thing, because as Chris brought up the budget surplus again, I alluded to the fact that there's 1.2 million households paying more than half their income as rent. It would cost about $9 billion to eliminate anyone paying more than half their income as rent. So if you think about, is it worth kind of to reduce homelessness by 75%? Is $9 billion, which is less than 1/10 of our surplus, worth it? I would argue yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now throw it open to questions from the floor to any of our panelists. Yeah.
Heard San Diego and Florida cities have had some recent success. I don't know if that's true. I'm curious if there are other cities in California that you would point to as doing something differently than LA or San Francisco that we could learn from.
Can you guys repeat the question?
Yeah, the suggestion was to repeat the question before you answer it. Yeah, go ahead.
So I believe I heard the question as,
Are there other cities in California that have done things that you could, you might point to as good solutions?
is there one more?
Well, I mean, Regina, you presented a case, right, of
I think he's
Santa
saying
Clara
other-
County.
I thought he was saying other
Oh.
than what I presented.
Right.
Is that right?
There we
Sorry,
go.
that's
Well,
not
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
I'm just looking for,
So you
is
count.
anyone
You-
else
you
doing
can
well
be-
in
yeah.
this in California?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'll just give a little context for what I presented, which is that in Santa Clara County, the voters passed Measure A in 2016, which was a $950 million bond, really with the goal of reducing and ending homelessness. And so a lot of the funding is geared towards extremely low-income households, households who are chronically homeless, households who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And so that was sort of the context of where I shared like the work that has been done. Prior to that, in Santa Clara County, we had less than 100 units of permanent supportive housing, very few even rapid rehousing units. And so we really ramped up since 2016 in addressing the issue of displacement in our community and understanding that these were our community members that were being displaced due to economic factors. And it's still ongoing, and I believe about 75% of the funds have been spent, and so it's just an effort to really address something that for too long was going unaddressed.
I'll just say something about San Diego and Long Beach, just as an example. But San Diego, and Kevin Faulkner obviously is our keynote later. Maybe you'll ask him again. Even though the survey said most people thought it wasn't about money, we actually are in an extreme scarcity environment as it relates to providing housing to people who are currently unhoused. And so San Diego, what they did is they reoriented their both health and housing resources in a particular way that prioritized people experiencing homelessness. They had to because of the hepatitis crisis. And so because of all of that, those resources actually did reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness. And so at the point, the crisis is so large that it can't be not resources plus policy. It is a resources plus policy. And Long Beach has done some interesting things. And I was going to say, Mark, you the next panel or the next conference is on governance. You could have a third one on governance in homeless services that would also take up a day. Because there's different ways that Long Beach is its own continuum of care, and they orient their health and services in a way that one might argue provides promising pathways. I'll stop.
And even within cities, there are bright spots that you can look at, right? Even within LA, Santa Monica had a system for older adults that paid supplemental income to prevent their homelessness that resulted in that population not becoming homeless. Veterans, even in the wake of things increasing gigantically, even in LA, has largely been flat. And even went 50% down and maintained largely. Those are both examples of situations where when we provide that floor, right, veterans have a VASH voucher and a level of entitlement that other populations don't have. You see the protection that exists even in this raging economy.
Next question. Does someone have? Great. Go for it.
Yes, I have a question that I'd like to ask in regards to the chronically homeless. That I know in Santa Clara County there's been a building that was developed for the homeless. And when you talk about the chronically homeless and you talk about drug addiction and mental health, and then you start reporting the increase in homelessness with people who cannot afford their housing, how do you plan to incorporate the two? Because I can see a problem with the newly homeless and the chronically homeless living in the same building, with means of survival and also with the newly homeless, newly becoming homeless people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So, you heard it on the mic. I'll just answer it quickly. We went on a trip to Trieste in Italy. It's a model that has been written up a bunch of times around how they got beyond a lockdown mental health care approach. What shocked me was that we have like a 20-to-1 case manager ratio that we aim for here. They had a 1-to-5 ratio of one person being served by 5 people. That's how they did it. So they substituted care for control, and it worked. They were able to release people from prison to an apartment, someone who had murdered someone violently, and without restraint were able to care for them and have a collaborative living environment. So it is possible. Again, it's a matter of, do we want to invest in that? They had a means of also stipending peers at a much higher level. So a lot of that case management ratio was made up of peers at a stipend basis. But that's how I think you have to wrap around to provide, not leave people to themselves, but provide the community of care.
Just 2 quick questions. One, I'm curious how much it costs per unit to add in San Jose. And then, I guess, bigger picture, even if we distributed the $9 billion, would that really solve the problem? There simply aren't units.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like we have 10% vacancy. I'm just curious how that really would do the trick.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to the cost. Costs of construction are going up. In the Bay Area, in San Jose in particular, it can easily cost, $750,000 per unit of affordable housing. And so, but I think the cost alone seems tremendous. But then when you look at the cost of having folks who are unhoused on our human services systems, on our healthcare systems, on our public safety systems, it far outweighs the cost to build a unit. And then when we look at the tremendous wealth we're building, to Chris's point, we know that we could certainly afford to build enough housing for everyone, and then to Gary's point, to help everyone stay housed and prevent displacement. So in context of all of the tremendous factors at play, it really is something that we want to be committed to. And again, we see that it's paying off in Santa Clara County.
Yeah, I don't think just the benefit alone magically houses people. Absolutely true. But without it, certain people will never be housed, regardless. So I would say, like, in the necessary but insufficient equations, we accept the other direction, but we almost never talk about the income benefit part. I also would say that there are a way to structure rental subsidies from the prior questions to package it, back it, which is what I meant by back, locally government backed, in a way to structure it to let people build off of it without additional construction subsidies. So I think there's a way to package, collateralize it, and securitize it to allow private development off those subsidies if you structure it appropriately.
We're going to have to call it there. I want to thank our wonderful panelists. I think we're in contention for the best panel of the day. Thank you so much.